Chapter 1: The Flight They Never Waited For. I was 19 when my parents left me alone in a foreign airport. No money, no return ticket, no explanation. Just silence. Years later, I walked back into their boardroom not as their daughter, but as the one signature that could freeze their entire empire. My name is Serafina, and this is the story they thought would disappear forever. I still remember the smell of jet fuel and polished floors the morning my parents walked away from me. It was early summer of 2010, and I was 19 years old, standing inside Budapest Ferenc Liszt International Airport with a single suitcase and a thin folder of documents I barely understood. I had been told this trip was a short internship, a cultural experience, a way to grow up before returning home to the United States. That was the language my parents used when they explained it. Growth, independence, perspective. Words that sounded generous when spoken across a polished dining table in our Connecticut home. My family, the Holt family, did not do impulsive decisions. Holt Group had been built on patience, image, and long-term advantage. My father, Richard Holt, believed in clean narratives. My mother, Elaine Holt, believed in managing perception. In our house, nothing happened without a reason, and nothing was said without a calculation behind it. I did not know that at 19, not fully. I only knew that when they offered me the internship abroad, it sounded like trust, like approval, like they were finally letting me step into the adult world on my own. The airport was crowded, loud, alive with rolling luggage and overlapping languages. My parents stood beside me near the departure gate, calm and composed as always. My father checked his phone repeatedly. My mother adjusted her scarf, scanning the terminal with the same alert eyes she used at charity galas and investor dinners. When the announcement came over the loudspeaker, it was not for my flight, it was for theirs. There was a moment where everything slowed. My father said something about an urgent meeting in London, a last-minute change. My mother squeezed my shoulder and told me this was good timing, that I would be fine on my own for a few days. She said the apartment had already been arranged. She said we would talk soon. They kissed my cheek quickly, both of them already turning away before I could respond. I stood there, watching their backs disappear into the crowd, still believing they would turn around, still believing someone would wave, or smile, or say something reassuring. They did not. I remember the exact second I realized they were not coming back. It was not dramatic, it was quiet, a small, hollow feeling opening in my chest as the gate doors closed behind them. The first night alone passed in a blur of exhaustion and adrenaline. The apartment was small, furnished, impersonal, the kind of place arranged by assistants, not by family. I slept on top of the covers, fully dressed, my suitcase still closed. The next morning, I tried to call home. My father did not answer. My mother sent a brief reply hours later saying she was busy and would call later. Later never came. 3 days after they left, my debit card stopped working. I stood at a local grocery store with a basket of basic food, watching the cashier swipe the card again and again. She looked at me with polite confusion. I felt heat crawl up my neck as the transaction declined. I apologized and left everything behind, walking back onto the street with empty hands and a tightening throat. The landlord emailed me the following morning asking about rent confirmation. I reread the message several times, confused, then checked my account again. Nothing. I went to the bank branch listed on my paperwork, clutching my passport and documents, only to be told my account was restricted. They could not explain more. They suggested I contact the account holder. That was my father. I tried again to call, straight to voicemail. I left messages that grew shorter and more controlled each time. I did not cry yet. I was still trying to be reasonable, still trying to be the daughter they trusted. At the Student Services office connected to the internship, a woman with kind eyes explained that my placement was not officially sponsored. Without family support or a confirmed visa extension, they could not help me. She used the word temporary several times. Temporary stay, temporary arrangement, temporary solution. Each repetition felt like a warning. I started to understand that something was wrong, but I did not yet understand how deliberate it was. The email appeared by accident. I was using my mother's old tablet, the one she had left behind because she did not like traveling with too many devices. I opened the mail app looking for an address she had promised to send. Instead, I saw a thread already open, a conversation between my mother and someone named Daniel Mercer. He was a lawyer in New York. I recognized the firm name immediately. Holt Group had used them for years. The email was short, precise. My mother's writing was always precise. She referred to me as a complication, a risk, a legal liability. She wrote that my continued dependence could raise questions during the upcoming real estate acquisition scheduled for early 2011. She asked what steps were necessary to formally separate financial responsibility. I read it twice before the words settled. They had not forgotten me. They had removed me. I closed the tablet and sat very still on the edge of the bed. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. There was no dramatic breakdown, no screaming or sobbing, just a steady, unfamiliar clarity. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a delay. This was a decision. That night, I walked the streets until my feet ached, passing cafes and storefronts filled with people who belonged somewhere. I thought about calling home and confronting them, demanding an explanation, demanding help. But I knew how my parents handled conflict. They waited it out. They let silence do the work. I realized then that begging would only confirm the version of me they had already written: weak, dependent, inconvenient. So I did the one thing they never expected. I stopped asking. The job at the restaurant was illegal, under the table, paid in cash. The owner barely looked at my documents. He needed someone who could work long hours and ask few questions. I nodded and said yes. I learned quickly. I burned my hands, carried heavy trays, smiled until my face hurt. At night, I counted my earnings and planned meals down to the smallest detail. When I signed that agreement, I felt something shift inside me. It was not hope, it was resolve. I was no longer waiting to be rescued. I was no longer part of their timeline. I stood outside the restaurant after my first shift, the city lights reflecting off the pavement, my body exhausted and my mind strangely calm. For the first time since the airport, I was not afraid of being alone. I was afraid of going back. I did not know how long this chapter of my life would last. I did not know how I would survive or what it would cost me. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty: whatever happened next would be mine. Have you ever had a moment where you realized the people who were supposed to protect you had already chosen something else? And if so, what did you choose to become after that? Chapter 2. Survival Has a Price. I chose to survive quietly, which meant learning how to disappear without vanishing. The years that followed did not move forward in a straight line. They folded in on themselves, stretched thin, then snapped tight again. Between 2011 and 2016, my life existed in fragments scattered across Hungary and Austria, held together by routine, caution, and a constant awareness that one wrong moment could undo everything I had built. I learned early that staying in one place too long invited questions. Questions led to documents. Documents led to exposure. So I moved when patterns formed, when a neighbor learned my name, when a coworker asked too much about my past, when a landlord started requesting paperwork I could not provide. My suitcase became lighter each time, not because I owned less, but because I stopped unpacking. Work was physical and relentless, cleaning offices after hours, washing dishes in kitchens that never fully cooled down, carrying crates at markets before sunrise. I learned to pace my body, to conserve energy the way other people conserved money. Pain became background noise. Hunger became manageable. Fear became useful. At night, when the city finally quieted, I studied. I bought second-hand language books and practiced until my tongue ached. Hungarian first, then German. Not fluency, just enough to blend in, to avoid standing out. I listened to conversations on buses, repeated phrases under my breath, memorized sounds. Language became another form of camouflage. It was during one of those transitions that I met Nadia Kovacs. She owned a small bakery on a narrow street outside Vienna, the kind of place that smelled like yeast and burnt sugar from half a block away. I had come in looking for work, expecting the usual polite refusal. Instead, she studied me for a long moment, then asked how many hours I could stand on my feet. She offered me a deal that felt like rescue. I would work mornings in the bakery and evenings cleaning the prep space. In return, she had a room above the shop I could sleep in. No lease, no questions, cash every week. I said yes before she finished explaining. For a while, it felt like safety. The room was small but warm. The bakery was busy. Nadia spoke loudly, laughed easily, told customers stories about her childhood that made them smile. She introduced me as a distant cousin. I did not correct her. But gratitude has a way of blurring into obligation. The hours stretched longer. Days off disappeared. When I mentioned exhaustion, Nadia reminded me how lucky I was. When I asked for pay, she told me I should think of the room as part of my compensation. Her kindness had conditions, and the conditions shifted whenever it suited her. I stayed because I had nowhere else to go, because the bakery gave me cover, because stability, even imperfect, was precious. The first sign of real danger came quietly. A question from Nadia about my papers, a comment about inspectors, a suggestion that I should stay upstairs during certain hours. I felt the tension before I understood it, the way animals sense weather changing. The knock on the door came early one morning, just as the ovens were warming up. It was sharp and official, cutting through the routine like a blade. Nadia froze. Her eyes flicked toward the stairs, then back to the door. Two men stood outside. They spoke calmly, professionally. Immigration police. They asked for documents, for identification, for names. Nadia did not look at me when she stepped aside. I remember the sound of my own breathing, too loud in the small space, the feel of flour on my hands, the realization, clear and devastating, that she had chosen herself the same way my parents had. I did not run. There was nowhere to run. I answered questions carefully, my words measured, my accent controlled. They asked my age. I told them. They asked when I arrived. I told them the truth, as much of it as I could afford. The holding room was cold. Time lost meaning. I thought about my parents then, not with anger, but with a detached understanding. This was the cost of being disposable. Victoria Hale entered my life because someone noticed a discrepancy. She was an immigration and human rights attorney based in Vienna, notified after an officer flagged my file for review. I was barely listening when she introduced herself, too tired to hope for anything. She asked questions no one else had asked, about my parents, about how I had been left, about my age when it happened. When she requested my records, everything slowed again. She read carefully, took notes, made calls. She did not promise anything. She explained the process, the risks, the uncertainty. But she also said something that shifted the ground beneath me, that abandonment of a minor carried weight, that responsibility did not dissolve just because someone boarded a plane. The months that followed were suspended between fear and patience. Hearings, paperwork, waiting rooms filled with people whose lives were also on hold. I learned how to sit still without feeling powerless, how to answer questions without revealing too much, how to breathe through uncertainty. Nadia never contacted me again. I did not expect her to.
In late 2016, I received temporary humanitarian residency. The document was thin, unremarkable, but it changed everything. It did not erase what had happened. It did not make me safe overnight, but it gave me something I had not had in years: time. I walked out of the building holding that paper and felt nothing resembling joy. Relief, yes; exhaustion; a strange emptiness. Surviving demanded constant vigilance, constant compromise. It had taught me how fragile trust could be. I understood then that surviving was not a victory, it was a transaction, and I had paid for it with my belief that help came without strings, that kindness did not require proof, that people did not always choose themselves first. That understanding stayed with me as I planned my next move, knowing the hardest part was not what I had endured, but what I would carry forward into the life I was about to build.
Chapter 3. The woman they erased no longer exists. I carried that understanding with me across the Atlantic, not as baggage, but as a filter through which I would rebuild everything. In early 2017, when my temporary status finally converted into lawful permanent residency, I bought a one-way ticket to New York. I did not tell anyone I was leaving. There was no one left to inform, and no past worth announcing. At the airport this time, I walked alone by choice, not abandonment, and that difference mattered more than I expected. I did not use my full name when I arrived. Serafina Holtz stayed behind with the girl who had waited at Budapest airport. I shortened it, filed paperwork, updated records. The process was bureaucratic, slow, unromantic, but every form felt like a quiet declaration. I was no longer traceable through the family that erased me. New York was overwhelming in the way only a city built on ambition could be. Everything moved fast. No one lingered. No one asked unnecessary questions. It suited me. I rented a small room in Queens, worked days, and studied nights. My focus was narrow and intentional. I was not trying to be impressive. I was trying to be precise. I chose risk and compliance because it rewarded people who paid attention, because it dealt in systems, not sentiment, because in that world, everything left a trail. Decisions, omissions, shortcuts, all of them documented somewhere, waiting for someone patient enough to connect them. My first real job was entry-level, unremarkable, quiet. I reviewed reports, flagged inconsistencies, learned how organizations protected themselves from exposure, or failed to. I learned how often harm came not from malice, but from convenience, from choosing the easier explanation, from silence. It was during a professional training seminar in Boston that I met Margaret Doyle. She was in her late 50s, sharp-eyed, deliberate, the kind of woman who listened more than she spoke. We ended up seated next to each other during a workshop on regulatory failure. At lunch, she asked where I was from. I gave her the edited version. She nodded, as if she understood what I was not saying. Later that afternoon, when I challenged a hypothetical scenario presented by the instructor, she leaned over and said quietly, "You notice what people hope no one will look at." We started having coffee after sessions, then dinners. She never pushed for details. She shared pieces of her own story instead. How she had been pushed aside in her family business when she questioned an unethical expansion plan. How they framed her exit as instability. How she learned to build influence without permission. "Silence is not absence," she told me once. "It is positioning." Those words stayed with me. By 2020, I had moved to Boston permanently. The work was better, the environment more controlled. I advanced steadily, not by networking, but by being consistently correct. I built a reputation for accuracy, not personality. It was enough. I did not follow my parents' lives closely. That would have required effort, and I had learned to conserve mine. But one afternoon, while waiting for a delayed meeting to start, I scrolled through a business magazine left on the conference table. Elaine Holt was on the page. The article was framed as a profile of resilience, a woman balancing corporate pressure and personal sacrifice. There was a photograph of her, composed and soft-lit, hands folded just so.
The headline referenced family challenges, loss, letting go. I read the interview slowly, line by line. She spoke about a daughter who struggled abroad, about heartbreak, about having to accept that some children choose different paths. She never used my name. She never said abandoned. She implied distance as mutual, as inevitable. My silence had become useful. I felt something tighten in my chest, not anger, but recognition. This was not an accident. This was narrative management. The same skills she had used for decades, now applied to motherhood. That night, I called Margaret. They are telling my story without me, I said. She did not ask who. She did not ask how I felt. She said only, then it is time to start documenting. I did not confront my parents. I did not write an email. I did not reach out to correct the record. I did something quieter and far more deliberate. I began collecting. Public filings, corporate disclosures, real estate transactions, old trusts, and amended ownership structures. Anything connected to Holt Group that intersected with my name, however faintly. I requested records through proper channels. I saved articles, archived interviews, cross-referenced dates. At first, it felt obsessive. Then it felt familiar. This was the same vigilance survival had taught me, redirected into something structured. I understood now that silence could be read as weakness, or it could be read as patience. The difference depended on who was watching. Margaret reviewed my notes one evening over dinner. "You are not preparing for revenge," she said. "No," I replied. "I am preparing for clarity." She smiled then, a small, knowing curve of her mouth. That is more dangerous. The work continued. Promotions came. Responsibilities expanded. I stayed careful not to let my personal history bleed into professional spaces, but privately, the file grew thicker. Dates aligned. Patterns emerged. I did not know yet how or when it would matter, only that the truth had weight, and weight eventually shifted balance. By the end of 2023, I was no longer the woman they erased. I was someone else entirely, someone who understood how systems protected themselves, someone who knew that stories without evidence could collapse quietly all at once. Before I closed the file one evening, I paused and considered a question I had avoided for years. At what point does staying silent stop being survival and start becoming strategy? If you have ever held your tongue not because you were afraid, but because you were preparing, then you already know the difference.
Chapter 4. Coming Home Without Asking for Permission. Preparation changes the way you walk into a room. In 2024, when I returned to the world my family had built, I did not arrive as a daughter. I arrived as a consultant. The contract came through a third-party firm based in Boston, one of those quiet advisory groups that existed to solve problems no one wanted publicly attached to their name. The email was brief. A complex real estate restructuring, multiple legacy assets, elevated regulatory exposure. They needed someone with experience in risk and compliance, someone precise, discreet, and external. The client name was listed as Holt Group. I read the email twice, not because I was surprised, but because timing has a way of announcing itself when you are ready to hear it. I accepted without hesitation, under my shortened name, with credentials that stood on their own. There was no reason for anyone to look deeper. People rarely did when the work spoke clearly enough. The first meeting was scheduled in New York, in a glass conference room overlooking a river my parents once claimed symbolized stability. I arrived early, as I always did, and set my materials out neatly. When the doors opened and the room filled, I recognized every familiar gesture before I recognized the faces. My father had aged, but not softened. He still entered rooms as if they owed him attention. My mother followed, composed, scanning, already shaping the story she would later tell about how the meeting went. They did not look at me twice. To them, I was another professional brought in to manage an inconvenience. I kept my posture neutral, my expression unreadable. I introduced myself when prompted. No one reacted. The discussion moved quickly. They outlined the project, speaking in generalities, avoiding specifics. It was Thomas Reed who shifted the air in the room. He was the external auditor assigned to oversee the restructuring. Younger than most, sharp, calm, with the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly where the vulnerabilities were. "There is an outstanding issue," he said, scrolling through a document on the screen, "one that predates several of the current ownership structures." My father frowned slightly. He disliked surprises. Thomas continued. "Certain legacy assets were originally placed under a trust involving a minor beneficiary. Subsequent amendments appear incomplete." The room stilled. My mother leaned forward. "That was resolved years ago." Thomas glanced at me briefly, then back at the screen. "Not entirely," he said. "Based on current documentation, final authorization remains outstanding, specifically from the original beneficiary." My father exhaled sharply. "That is not possible." Thomas turned the screen so everyone could see. The name was there, unmistakable. Mine. There was a pause that stretched longer than any silence I had ever known with my family. My mother looked at the screen, then at me, then back again, as if her eyes were misfiring. My father did not look at me at all. He stared straight ahead, calculating. Thomas cleared his throat. "Given the regulatory environment, we cannot proceed with written consent or an equivalent legal acknowledgement." The room shifted. Lawyers murmured. Someone adjusted their chair. My mother finally spoke. "You did not mention this before." Thomas replied evenly. "The file was not complete before now." All eyes turned toward me. I felt the weight of it then, not power in the dramatic sense, but gravity, the kind that altered movement without effort. I folded my hands on the table. "I will not be providing consent today," I said. My voice was steady. There was no tremor, no satisfaction, just fact. My father finally looked at me. Recognition flickered, sharp and disbelieving. "You," he said quietly. I met his gaze without flinching. "Yes." My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. Years of practiced composure faltered. "This is inappropriate. You should have disclosed your connection." "I did," I replied. "All required disclosures were made. My work stands independent of personal history." The lawyers exchanged glances. Thomas remained silent, observing. My father leaned forward. "What do you want?" The question was familiar. It was the same one they asked investors, partners, anyone who stood in the way. It assumed negotiation. It assumed leverage. I shook my head slightly. This is not a negotiation. The silence that followed was heavier than anger. It was the sound of plans recalculating in real time. "We will need to revisit this," my mother said, her tone controlled, her eyes searching my face for something she could use. I gathered my documents calmly. "You will need to address the underlying issue before there is anything to revisit." My father stood abruptly. "This meeting is over." Thomas looked at him, unbothered. "The meeting is paused," he corrected, "pending resolution." I stood as well. "I will await further instruction from the firm," I said. As I walked out of the room, I felt none of the triumph I might have imagined years earlier. No rush, no relief. Only the quiet certainty that something fundamental had shifted. In the hallway, Thomas caught up with me. "You planned this," he said, not accusing, not impressed. "I prepared," I replied. He nodded once. That usually makes all the difference. I left the building without looking back. The days that followed were strangely calm. No calls from my parents, no emails, just a flurry of internal correspondence among legal teams, revisions, postponements. The project stalled. Questions multiplied. I knew my parents were used to obstacles. They were not used to being the unresolved variable.
One evening, my mother finally called. "We need to talk," she said. I did not answer immediately. "We have never talked," I replied. Silence stretched between us, familiar and newly uncomfortable. "This affects more than just us," she said. "I know." There was nothing else to say. When the call ended, I sat alone in my apartment, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. I did not feel victorious. I felt present, fully, finally present in a space I had once been erased from. They could not move forward without facing what they had buried, and I did not need to push. Time and structure were doing that work for me. I closed my laptop and let the room settle around me, knowing the next step would not be loud, but it would be inevitable.
Chapter 5. Stronger, Not Bitter. I woke the next morning to silence that felt earned rather than empty. By early 2025, the consequences of that paused meeting had begun to surface in places my parents could not control. Deals did not collapse overnight. That was never how Holt Group operated. Instead, things slowed. Questions multiplied. Timelines slipped. Partners requested additional reviews, then additional assurances. A few quietly withdrew, citing changing priorities. The first article appeared in a trade publication I had bookmarked years ago. It did not name me. It did not need to. It spoke about legacy firms facing increased scrutiny, about unresolved ownership structures complicating otherwise routine transactions. It used words like cautious and delayed. For a company built on momentum, that was enough to cause concern. My parents did not reach out immediately. They never did when the ground was shifting. They waited to see if control could be reasserted without confrontation. When it could not, my mother asked to meet. She chose a quiet restaurant in Boston, the kind of place that prided itself on discretion. She arrived early, I arrived on time. She stood when she saw me, then seemed to think better of it and sat back down. "You look well," she said. I nodded and took my seat. "You look the same," I replied. We ordered without ceremony. There was a practiced ease in her movements, the familiar choreography of someone used to managing rooms, but something underneath had changed. The confidence had softened at the edges. "This situation has become complicated," she began. I let her speak. I had learned the value of listening. "We have worked very hard to build what we have," she continued. "Your father and I have made sacrifices." I smiled faintly. "So have I." She paused, then tried a different approach. "You could help resolve this. You know that." I met her gaze. "You want my consent." She exhaled. "I want resolution." I leaned back slightly. "Those are not the same thing." Her fingers tightened around her glass. "You are punishing us." I shook my head. "I am declining to participate in something that was built by excluding me." The words hung between us, not sharp, not cruel, just true. She looked at me for a long moment, searching for an opening, for emotion, for leverage. "I did not need your permission to survive," I said quietly. "I do not need your acknowledgement to move forward." Her voice lowered. "What do you want from us?" I considered the question, then answered honestly, "Nothing." That seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. "You do not want an apology?" "No." "You do not want compensation?" "No." "Then what is this?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt a strange absence where resentment might have lived. "This is consequence." She stared at the table. For the first time, I saw something like uncertainty cross her face. "You were very young," she said finally. "We did what we thought was necessary." I stood. "You did what was convenient." She did not argue. When I left the restaurant, the air felt lighter, not because anything had been resolved between us, but because I no longer needed it to be. In the weeks that followed, Holt's Group continued to struggle quietly. Nothing public enough to spark scandal, but enough to change internal dynamics. Leadership meetings stretched longer, advisors multiplied. The past refused to stay buried. I did not intervene. I did not escalate. I allowed systems to do what they were designed to do when something foundational was unstable.
Margaret called one evening as I was finishing work. "I think it is time," she said. I knew what she meant. We met at her office, a modest space filled with light and old case files. She had spent years working with organizations that supported children caught in legal gray zones, those abandoned across borders, forgotten in paperwork. "You understand both sides now," she said, "the vulnerability and the structure." I nodded. We drafted the outline together, a program focused on legal advocacy and transitional support for minors abandoned internationally. Not charity alone, but systems, documentation, protection. I agreed to fund the initial phase and lend my expertise, quietly, without my name attached. "You are not trying to rewrite the story," Margaret said. "You are building something better alongside it." That felt right. By the end of the year, the program was operational, small at first, then growing. I attended meetings where caseworkers spoke about children who reminded me of myself, not in personality, but in circumstance. I listened more than I spoke. One afternoon, as I was walking out of the office, my phone buzzed with a notification. Another article, another mention of Holt's group delaying a major initiative. I read it without emotion and kept walking. I no longer measured my life against theirs. On a cold evening near the end of winter, I stood by my window watching snow fall in uneven patterns across the city. Somewhere, my parents were still managing narratives, still adjusting, still insisting that time would smooth things over. They might be right, but I had learned that time did not heal everything. Sometimes it clarified. I was not stronger because I had won. I was stronger because I had stopped needing to. If you have ever been the one quietly removed so others could move forward, if you have ever been told that your absence was necessary for someone else's success, I want you to know this. Survival does not have to harden you. Preparation does not have to turn into bitterness. There is a way to step out of the story that hurt you and build something that protects others from the same ending. If this story resonated with you, share it. Leave a comment. Tell me what you carried forward and what you chose to become because of it. Stay with the channel for more stories about quiet strength, earned clarity, and the kind of justice that doesn't need to announce itself to be real.